Ego is a fascinating thing. In small doses, it builds confidence. In large doses, it builds coffins. Today, we're looking at 12 people so convinced the rules didn't apply to them that they walked straight into consequences science had been warning them about their entire lives. No accidents, no bad luck, just pure, unstoppable overconfidence meeting reality. To those who've already subscribed, thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe now. Let us begin. 1. The Bull Challenge. Outside Amarillo, Texas, 48-year-old Dale Mercer had spent so many years around cattle that he began to confuse familiarity with control. He ran a modest property, handled his own feed schedules, and liked to tell neighbors that animals sensed confidence. What he meant was simpler. He believed they sensed him. That belief met a 1,200-kilogram Charolais cross named Buckhorn on a windless August afternoon. Buckhorn had been separated into a side pasture because his behavior had changed over the summer. He was becoming more territorial, more reactive, more willing to square up at anything entering his space. Dale knew this. His farmhand, Luis Ortega, had mentioned it repeatedly after seeing the bull paw at the ground, lower his head, and lock onto movement near the gate. Those are not subtle signals. They are textbook warnings. Every experienced cattle handler knows they mean the same thing. Increase distance now. Dale opened the gate and walked in anyway. Luis later said he expected Dale to check a trough latch and step back out. Instead, Dale kept moving toward the animal with his shoulders square, posture upright, and eyes fixed straight ahead. To another person, that stance might read as authority. To a bull, it reads as a challenge. Dale was communicating in the animal's language without understanding the grammar. Buckhorn responded instantly. The field was open. There was no fence panel close enough to climb, no tractor to circle, no tree line to use as cover. By the time Dale understood he had not entered a contest but an inevitability, the distance was already gone. Luis heard the impact before he reached the fence and later told investigators the whole interaction lasted only seconds. Veterinary review found nothing unusual in the bull's behavior. In fact, that was the point. Buckhorn had done exactly what powerful territorial breeding bulls do when approached aggressively inside their own space. Local livestock professionals were blunt afterward. The warning signals had been obvious, readable, and non-negotiable. Dale Mercer had not been betrayed by the animal. He had been betrayed by the story he told himself about how animals worked around him. 2. The Live Panel. In Spokane Valley, Washington, 39-year-old Martin Keller had spent years doing his own electrical work and surviving it. He rewired a laundry room, swapped fixtures, replaced outlets, and even upgraded a garage sub-panel without incident. Each successful job made the next one feel less like risk and more like proof. By the time he started talking about replacing the main service panel in his basement, he no longer described himself as handy. He described licensed electricians as people protected by regulation, not expertise. Martin said he didn't need to. He believed the breakers he controlled inside the house were enough isolation for the work. They were not. The supply side of a main service panel stays live regardless of breaker position. That fact is basic, documented, and deadly. It is also the reason service upgrades require coordination with the utility and are restricted to trained professionals. Martin knew the incoming voltage was far beyond ordinary household circuits. What he did not understand was that this difference eliminated the margin for error he thought experience had earned him. Naomi later told investigators she had even offered to call the utility the previous evening. She had been told this disconnect could be scheduled in a matter of hours. Martin declined. He said the job would be finished before the crew even arrived. When Naomi came downstairs after hearing the sound, the panel was open and the room smelled of burned insulation. A new breaker box sat nearby in partially torn packaging. On the bench were labeled wires, insulated tools, and a handwritten checklist that might have looked reassuring to someone who didn't know what was missing from it. No service ticket, no disconnection confirmation, no actual control over the power feeding the house. The investigation was painfully straightforward. Martin Keller had built a credential out of consequence-free shortcuts, then attempted the one category of residential electrical work that does not forgive misunderstanding. His family had recognized the danger. The utility company had a process for preventing it. Martin's confidence told him procedure was for other people. Electricity remained unconvinced. 3. The Skipped Stop. At a dive charter in Key Largo, Florida, 34-year-old Aaron Pike had developed a reputation that sounded mild until you understood what it meant underwater. He was impatient. He had several years of recreational dives logged and had surfaced from plenty of them, feeling fine even after shortening stop times. Gradually, he stopped reading those uneventful endings as luck. He read them as evidence that his body simply tolerated risk better than the tables assumed. On the morning that ended that theory, Ariane entered the water with Elena Ruiz and Marcus Hale for a reef wall dive that went deep enough and long enough to remove all ambiguity from the ascent plan. When it was time to come up, his dive computer clearly indicated a decompression obligation. It did not suggest one. It indicated one. Aaron acknowledged the alert and ascended anyway. Marcus later said Aaron hovered through only a fraction of the required stop time, checked his display, and then kicked for the surface with the same irritated confidence he had shown on previous dives. It was not an isolated decision. Reviewing his recent logbook afterward, Elena found a pattern of abbreviated stops across multiple outings. Aaron had been gambling repeatedly with the same physics and had mistaken repeated survival for a biological exemption. Within 20 minutes of surfacing, he complained of pain in his shoulders and elbows. Then came numbness in one hand. Both Elena and the dive master recognized the symptoms immediately. They are textbook signs of decompression sickness. Aaron insisted at first that it was the cold water. Then he blamed fatigue. By the time he stopped negotiating with the obvious, his balance had begun to deteriorate. Emergency treatment was arranged, and recompression was attempted. But the central fact of the case never changed. Decompression illness is not random punishment. It is a predictable consequence of ignoring gas loading limits your body does not get to vote on. Medical reviewers later noted that the required stops on Aaron's profile were not optional safety theater. They were the minimum cost of returning safely to the surface. Aaron Pike had skipped that cost before and gotten away with it. On this dive, the debt arrived all at once. 4. The Ridgeline Gap. Near Lauterbrunnen, Switzerland, 31-year-old Julian Strasser had become known for flying proximity lines that made other pilots quietly step back from the footage. He was genuinely skilled. That was part of the danger. In wingsuit flying, recklessness alone does not build a resume. Precision does, repetition does, survival does. And once enough successful flights accumulate, survival begins whispering that the margin is there because of you, not because of how carefully it was managed. Julian planned a line that required passing through a narrow ridgeline gap at a precise altitude and angle, the sort of route where the planning is the sport and the flight is merely execution. He had flown variations of it before. What he had not done was fly that exact line in the exact wind conditions present that day. Two members of his group, Daniel Meyer and Sophie Kramer, studied the forecast and declined. A crosswind component was building across the gap, enough to matter exactly where Julian intended to be closest to terrain. They saw the data and treated it as a boundary. Julian saw the same data and treated it as manageable. That word did not survive the jump. Investigators later reviewed his helmet camera footage and consulted experienced proximity pilots. The consensus was remarkably consistent. The available weather information before takeoff was sufficient to show that conditions sat outside reasonable parameters for that specific line. Nothing hidden emerged mid-flight. No freak event appeared from nowhere. The risk had been visible on the ground. The early part of the flight looked controlled. Then the crosswind began converting a minor lateral displacement into a fatal one. At wingsuit speed, a small error is only small for an instant. Correction came too late because the line no longer belonged to the pilot. It belonged to the conditions he had discounted. The mountain did not surprise Julian Strasser. It simply enforced the margin he had chosen to shrink. 5. The chlorine mix. In a flat in Leeds, England, 42-year-old Nathan Crow decided a blocked bathroom drain was beneath the patience of ordinary methods. Nathan liked to think of himself as scientifically literate. He remembered enough school chemistry to pronounce the right terms, enough to feel superior while reading warning labels, and not enough to understand that confidence is not a neutral substance when chemicals are involved. On the sink sat two products, a bleach-based cleaner and an acidic drain opener. Each label warned against mixing with other cleaning agents, especially in enclosed spaces. Nathan had read the labels. His sister, Leanne, later said he even joked that companies had to write those things for people who didn't understand chemistry. Nathan was not a chemist. He closed the bathroom door, left the extractor fan off, and combined the products to speed things up. What he made instead was chlorine gas. The reaction was not obscure, theoretical, or unfair. It was exactly the kind of hazard those labels exist to prevent. Chlorine is dangerous precisely because it reaches debilitating concentrations quickly in enclosed areas, and Nathan had chosen a small tiled room with poor ventilation and a shut door. Neighbors later heard violent coughing followed by a heavy impact. By the time emergency crews forced entry, the room still held the evidence in plain view. Two open containers, warning labels facing outward, residue around the basin, and a drain that remained very much clogged. The products had behaved exactly as their manufacturers said they would. Nathan had not. Hazardous materials officers reviewing the scene afterward noted how ordinary the ingredients of the disaster were. There was no experimental lab setup, no obscure compound, no unusual chain of failures. There was a man who believed general intelligence made him personally exempt from chemical instructions written for the public. Nathan Crow had mistaken recognition for understanding, and in chemistry that is often enough to become the entire tragedy. 6. The wrong route. At Red River Gorge, Kentucky, 27-year-old Evan Hollis had spent 2 seasons building a reputation as the local climber who moved fast, looked calm, and loved the photo more than the conversation afterward. He had free-soloed easier routes successfully, trained hard, and grown comfortable enough on exposed rock that people started using the word fearless around him. Fearless is usually what preparation looks like to observers who cannot see the rehearsal behind it. The problem for Evan was that he had begun to believe the image himself. He selected a steep sandstone route known among local climbers as Widow's Step, a line significantly harder than anything he had previously attempted without protection. He had climbed it twice on rope. In his mind, that was enough to remove the rope. Experienced solo climbers later reviewing the case were nearly unanimous on one point. 2 rope descents of a route at that grade do not constitute real preparation for a free solo. Serious route preparation is measured in repetition, memorization, and humility. Holds are cataloged. Body positions are rehearsed. Conditions are judged honestly. Every uncertain move remains a reason to keep the rope. Evan's notebook, recovered from his truck, revealed how he had prioritized the attempt. The section marked prep was blank. The section for conditions was also blank. 2 hikers on an adjacent trail saw him on the wall that morning. One later said he looked completely composed until he reached the crux sequence high above the ground. That is how solo errors often work. The route does not need to overwhelm you. It only needs one move you know conceptually but not deeply enough to own under consequence. Investigators could identify the likely failure point from scuff marks, chalk, and previous partner descriptions of where Evan had struggled on rope. It was the exact section other climbers said should have kept him tied in for many more rehearsals. Evan Hollis did not die because the route was impossible. He died because he promoted himself to ready before the route had agreed. 7. The speed gamble. Outside Temecula, California, 29-year-old Bryce Nolan rode a high-performance motorcycle with the kind of confidence that other motorists notice first as fear. Drivers had reported him more than once for appearing in mirrors at impossible speed, slicing past traffic, and disappearing ahead with the casual violence unique to machines being used far outside their proper context. Bryce took those stories as backhanded compliments. He had never suffered a serious crash, and in his mind that meant the road had already tested him and found him exceptional. It had not. On the evening of the fatal ride, a pickup truck ahead suffered a mechanical problem and came to a partial stop with part of its body protruding into Bryce's lane. At normal road speed, the obstacle was visible from far enough away to allow the basic sequence survival depends on: see it, identify it, decide, brake, avoid. Bryce had more than doubled the posted limit. At that velocity, the sequence no longer fit inside the distance available. Investigators reconstructed his speed from physical evidence and onboard data. Their conclusion was blunt. He was moving so fast that by the time the truck entered usable perception, the time needed for recognition and response already exceeded the time the road gave him. In practical terms, exceptional reflexes were irrelevant because he had ridden beyond the range in which reflexes can still matter. The truck driver, Carl Benton, later said he had just activated his hazard lights when he heard what sounded less like an engine and more like structural failure. Bryce never meaningfully braked. That detail destroyed the fantasy that superior skill had simply been a fraction too slow that night. The truth was harsher. Bryce Nolan had been traveling at a speed where human reaction became ceremonial. 8. The unseen target. In dense woodland outside Marquette, Michigan, 51-year-old Dean Holloway spent nearly an hour tracking what he believed was a white-tailed deer moving through thick undergrowth. He heard sound, He saw intermittent motion. He caught broken color between saplings and built a conclusion out of fragments. This is exactly the moment hunting discipline is supposed to intervene, because expectation is powerful enough to turn maybe into yes before your eyes have actually earned it. Dean knew the fundamental rule. Every firearm instructor, hunting guide, and safety manual phrases it some version of the same way. Identify your target completely before placing your finger on the trigger. Not probably, not mostly, completely. Dean had repeated that rule to younger hunters himself. But rules repeated and rules obeyed are not the same thing. His hunting partner, Warren Fitch, later said Dean raised the rifle before there was any full animal visible in the clearing. What Dean had was movement, confidence, and the dangerous belief that his expectation filled in the missing visual information. He fired. The movement was not his target. Ballistics investigators determined the round struck a hardwood trunk at the clearing's edge, fragmented, and sent a piece of metal back toward the shooter's position. Dean was hit by a fragment of his own ammunition. Warren called emergency services immediately, but the irreversible part had already happened. Investigators later located the deer Dean had likely been tracking on the far side of the clearing, alive and completely out of any line that would have justified a shot. Reviewers from local firearms safety organizations emphasized the same bitter point. Bullets do not pause to verify assumptions in flight. Dean Holloway fired at a story his brain had already finished writing, and the only certainty in the clearing came afterward. 9. The missed check. At an exit point above Moab, Utah, 33-year-old Connor Vail had accumulated enough base jumps to look effortless. He moved with the easy calm of a man to whom preparation had become routine, and that was exactly where the problem lived. His partners, Lena Brooks and Peter Sato, had both noticed the same habit growing over time. Connor shortened his gear checks on jumps he considered familiar. He did not skip them entirely. That would have looked reckless even to him. Instead, he abbreviated. A thorough sequence became a quick pass of the hands, a glance where a confirmation should have been, and a confidence-based assumption that anything serious would somehow announce itself. When Lena challenged him, Connor said full checks were mainly for newer jumpers. Experience, he argued, meant he would notice what mattered. The logic collapsed in the exact way systematic checklists are designed to prevent. After the incident, investigators and a technical specialist examined the rig and found a deployment-related issue that was neither subtle nor obscure. It was the sort of problem a proper pre-jump inspection would have identified quickly and corrected on the ground. Connor's abbreviated process, the one that had saved him a minute and cost him a future, passed right over it. Peter and Lena completed their own checks and jumped without incident. Connor exited on the same object under the same conditions with the same confidence he had carried through hundreds of previous jumps. The difference between this jump and those ones was not that risk had suddenly become real. The difference was that this time the shortcut met a flaw instead of empty air. His logbook recorded 412 prior jumps. That number looks impressive until you understand what it actually measured. Not the soundness of the habit, only the number of times the habit had gone unpunished. The 413th jump was the first one that required the check to be real, and by then, Connor Vail had already trained himself to treat it as optional. 10. The late break. In Brisbane, Australia, 44-year-old Mitchell Crane turned late braking into a personality trait. With passengers in the car, he would approach traffic lights at speed and delay braking until what he called the last possible moment, then smile at the panic beside him as if alarm were proof of lesser nerve. He framed the behavior as skill, even as demonstration. According to Mitchell, ordinary drivers were limited by ordinary reaction times. He was not. Several former passengers disagreed strongly enough to file informal complaints with local traffic authorities over the years. The descriptions matched each other: fast approach, deliberate delay, bragging, laughter. No formal intervention followed, and Mitchell folded that lack of consequences into the story he already preferred. If nothing bad had happened, the method must be valid. Then the road got wet. Mitchell had effectively calibrated his stunt on dry asphalt and convinced himself the calibration belonged to him rather than to the conditions. On a rainy evening along a familiar route, he approached an intersection with the same confidence and the same timing. The signal changed. He waited. Then he hit the brakes at his usual point. Wet pavement changed the math he thought was personal. The vehicle data recorder later showed investigators the sequence with humiliating clarity: speed before braking, road condition, braking point, and the remaining distance to the intersection. The margin was not narrow. It was non-existent. Even a competent driver would have needed more room on that surface from that speed. Another vehicle lawfully entered the intersection. Its occupants were injured and survived. Mitchell did not. Reviewers comparing witness complaints with the event data found the same pattern repeated almost exactly. For years, Mitchell Crane had mistaken delayed punishment for superior ability. When friction dropped, the road stopped flattering him. 11. The river current. After heavy rain upstream of Asheville, North Carolina, the French Broad River was running high, fast, brown, and visibly dangerous. Debris moved in the flow. Warning signs stood at the access point. Locals on the bank did not need technical measurements to know the river was in no mood for negotiation. 36-year-old Ryan Delaney looked at the same scene and decided the warnings were meant for weaker swimmers. Ryan had real open water experience. He had raced in lakes, swum long distances, and talked confidently about current angles and body position. In calm water, those things matter. In mild current, they help. In flood-stage river flow, they become far less powerful than people want to believe. Moving water at volume does not test your effort. It simply applies force. Ryan laughed, gestured toward the sign, and said notices like that existed because authorities had to write for tourists and amateurs. Then he stepped into the river to prove a point to a force incapable of caring. Paula said the first seconds were almost worse for how undramatic they looked. Ryan did not thrash immediately. He was simply taken. The current moved him out of wading control and downstream before any visible swimming response could meaningfully develop. That is one of the cruel truths about powerful water. By the time people understand they are no longer choosing their movement, physics has often already decided the rest. Recovery took 2 days. When investigators documented the scene, the warning signs were still there, upright, visible, and perfectly explicit. Nothing had been hidden from Ryan Delaney except the fact that he belonged to the category of person those signs were written for. 12. The first test. In a workshop outside Dayton, Ohio, 50-year-old Leonard Voss spent a year and a half building what he called a personal propulsion harness, a homemade thrust system he believed could demonstrate a cleaner and more efficient configuration than anything hobbyists had managed before. Leonard was methodical, intelligent, and serious. He kept notebooks, ran calculations, machined parts himself, and believed deeply in the idea that if a person designs something carefully enough, that person becomes the natural authority on how it should be tested. Leonard had no remote test rig, no fixed stand for restrained ignition, no incremental power ladder proving how the system behaved at partial output, and no independent review from anyone whose job was to be less emotionally attached to the design than he was. The first meaningful test was also the first full power test, and Leonard chose to conduct it while wearing the device himself. In his reasoning, nobody was more qualified. Nobody understood it better. But understanding a design on paper is not the same as understanding a built machine under real operating load. Real systems introduce vibration, thermal expansion, tolerance stacking, fuel irregularities, and the one optimistic variable your notes quietly made smaller because the numbers looked better that way. Leonard's neighbor, Grace Minton, later said the activation sounded too violent for a first trial. Engineers reviewing the remains of the device agreed on the core point afterward. The machine had done what it was physically capable of doing. Leonard's estimate of maximum thrust had been optimistic, and because there had been no gradual testing process to expose that optimism safely, the first correction came with him attached to the result. His notes were careful. His workmanship was real. His curiosity was genuine. None of that changed the missing step between invention and survival. Leonard Voss built a system powerful enough to prove him wrong, then stood inside the experiment when it did. 12 cases. 12 people convinced they were the exception. Not one was stupid. Some were skilled. But confidence turned into certainty, and certainty turned into fatal mistakes. Every warning was there but ignored, because they believed the rules applied to someone else. The ones who last the longest aren't the most talented. They're the most honest about their limits. If you enjoy content like this, make sure you subscribe to Blunder Vault. The universe has a perfect record against overconfidence, and it never loses.